On today's episode of the Locked On Knicks podcast, I'm joined by Locked On Kings host Matt George to discuss the qualities that might just make Mike Brown the perfect replacement for Tom Thibodeau.
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, what's up, guys? My name is Gavin Schall. I'm a credentialed media member that has been covering the New York Knicks over the last 7 years. I'm your favorite play-by-play broadcaster's favorite play-by-play broadcaster, and typically the Saturday co-host of the Locked On NBA podcast, though last night I hosted the Monday edition, so tune in for that for a recap of Game 5 of the NBA Finals. But on this podcast, you've come for some Knicks talk because this is the Locked On Knicks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day, your daily podcast on the New York Knicks, giving you the most detailed insight on your favorite team at least 5 days a week. And be sure to join thousands of other Knicks fans in subscribing on both YouTube and your favorite podcast platform for the best insight on your favorite team every single day. On today's episode, once again, I'm going to be joined by Matt George. We're going to talk about Mike Brown, what makes him such an innovative mind offensively that helped the 2022-23 King put together at that point the best offensive season in NBA history in terms of offensive rating. We're going to talk about what makes him so good as a culture builder and why he shares some positive qualities with Tom Thibodeau in that respect. And that is actually quite a good thing. We're going to talk about how he is a defensive first coach, despite his success on the offensive end, how he holds guys accountable on that end of the floor. And then we're going to get into some of the potential drawbacks of hiring Mike Brown and what was perhaps the biggest stain on him as the head coach of the Sacramento Kings. But before we dive deep on all that, I want to remind you that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. All right, without further ado, let's get into it right now with Matt. All right, guys, as promised, we are lucky enough to be joined by Matt George, of course, the host of the Locked On Kings podcast, a reporter at ABC 10 in Sacramento. And we are doing a deep dive on what I presume is maybe his favorite, maybe his most frustrating topic, Mike Brown. Matt, how's it going, buddy?
It is good, my friend. I'm excited to talk about Mike Brown. I'm a huge fan of Mike's. Had a absolute blast covering his unfortunately far too short time period as the head coach of the Sacramento Kings. But I'm excited. I'm excited to talk about him because he's one of the good guys out there.
I found myself listening to a bunch of your episodes during the whole saga. Obviously, it's the biggest story in the NBA, and you were incredibly passionate about it. At times on this podcast, we've been incredibly passionate about it the opposite way, about firing Tom Thibodeau. So I'm glad our two passions could converge here for this episode. Let's start off with this because I think my opinion of Mike Brown changed pretty drastically over his time on the Kings. Like, I always thought, like, all right, he's kind of like solid replacement level coach, like did about what you would expect in Cleveland. I know some people were disappointed in his tenure on the Cavs. Similar with the Lakers, didn't really get a fair chance with the super team. Obviously only got 5 games that season. Fantastic as an assistant with the Warriors. And then he goes to Sacramento and a lot changed. But when the Kings first hired Mike Brown, were you super excited, or were you kind of like, all right, this is just sort of the next guy. It'll be 3 years and then it'll be another coach?
Now, this is where I have to be real and honest. Like, I was initially kind of underwhelmed, right?
Mhm.
There were other names that were out there, including like Darvin Ham at the time, that I was curious about, interested in, and was wondering if the Kings were going to go kind of in a younger coach, fresher face direction. And to bring back Mike Brown, who it was twofold. One, like you talked about, his time in Cleveland and his time in Los Angeles. It was like, okay, like we've seen it before. Plus, the Kings have had a tendency of just kind of plucking Golden State Warriors assistant coaches or just trying to copy the Golden State Warriors organization. So bringing in their lead assistant for Steve Kerr for so many years is like, okay, I'll see what it is. But like, Mike won me over immediately.
Mhm.
And it's, I'm sure we'll dive into like what he did and what he changed. But his introductory press conference in Sacramento, he sat down and immediately starts preaching about like the organization having a soul and everybody in the organization needing to be on the same page, and spoke about things that, quite frankly, have just not been in Sacramento for far too long, right? The Kings at the time were going into their 17th year without making the playoffs, a 16-year playoff drought, the longest in NBA history, right? And that's what Mike Brown inherited. That's what he took over. So very quickly, the feeling of being like underwhelmed by a familiar quote unquote retread coach turned into a love and appreciation for the veteran basketball mind and phenomenal human being that Mike Brown is.
Yeah, I think your point about him as a culture setter is really important because I know a lot of Knicks fans and a lot of Knicks analysts are hungry for exactly what you described, right? A fresh offensive mind after some of the stagnation, some of the maybe outdated tactics and philosophies on the offensive end of the floor under Tom Thibodeau. I know there is an eagerness to embrace modern offense, which we'll get into. Certainly is not an area that Mike Brown is lacking, but I think it's also very easy to take for granted what Tom Thibodeau did bring to the Knicks, right? Which was a stable culture, a preparedness on a game-to-game basis. I mean, the last 2 seasons, a regular season record of something just conservatively off the top of my head, something like 50-2 against teams like under 500 or teams out of the playoffs entirely. Like they were just ridiculously good at taking care of business against bad teams, and they had this incredible culture of competitiveness, of never being out of a game. We saw that throughout the playoffs, and I think it's totally plausible that Knicks could evolve tactically and take a step back in terms of that culture because it was something very similar to the Kings the Knicks did not have for about 2 decades until Tom Thibodeau came in. So it's interesting to hear that Mike Brown brings some of that. I'm going to ask a very open-ended question. I'll let you take it wherever you want, whether it's on the culture building side or whether it's just in terms of his scheme. What did he do to create the light the beam season, which was not only obviously just a revelation for Kings fans, but just as an outside observer, just one of the more magical seasons in recent NBA history. He became the first unanimous coach of the year, if I'm remembering that correctly, in that 2022-2023 season. How much credit does he deserve relative to the work the Kings front office did to put that team together in the team's success that year?
Well, the way you worded the question, I think, is interesting. You asked, what did he do? And I
Yeah.
think it's important for Knicks fans and all fans to understand what he did, which is something that, like, I think 12 other coaches between himself and Rick Adelman were not able to do. That's get the Sacramento Kings back to the postseason, get the Sacramento Kings back to a state of competency and relevancy and consistency, which is not like it is eluded some bright basketball minds that have come through Sacramento, from Michael Malone, who, granted, that situation was kind of wishy-washy and he was figuring things out before the Kings abruptly and stupidly fired him. Paul Westphal. There have been some names that have come through Sacramento that have had a lot of success in this league that are known for their successful coaching careers that completely fell on their face here at Sacramento. So Mike was able to come in and in one season turn that around. Like, that cannot be understated. That cannot be underappreciated. Now, in my opinion, the Knicks' job is polar opposite of the Kings' job. Right. If you're becoming the head coach of the New York Knicks after just being eliminated in the Eastern Conference Finals, it's championship or bust. Right. And I don't know how appealing. I know it's one of 30 NBA jobs. That's not an easy job. And I don't know how appealing that job is to anybody, especially Mike Brown. Now, Mike has experience of taking over teams with high expectations before. Sometimes it's gone well, young LeBron days. Other times, the Lakers or Cleveland 2.0, it hasn't gone very well. So he definitely has the experience to feel comfortable and confident with, I think, hiring him and giving him that opportunity. But that's a lot that's going to be on his shoulders. But going back to your question about what he did in Sacramento, he established a culture. Now, things later got rocky and difficult, and we can get into that if you want to. But he came in right away, said the right things. The Kings gave him the keys, and when they got out of the way, good things happened. Right, when the front office and the coaching staff, the ownership, like when they got out of the way, Mike Brown built something, established something, got the Sacramento Kings to be one of the best offenses in NBA history. In fact, the best offense in NBA history at the time. Since then, those numbers have been shattered by teams like the Indiana Pacers. But at the time, there was not a better offense in NBA history, right? He managed to maximize the DHO game through Domantas Sabonis, helped De'Aaron Fox make all NBA and be an all-star for the first time, right? And turn the Sacramento Kings from a team that had not really come close to 40 wins to a third seed in the Western Conference and giving the defending champion Warriors all they could handle in that first round, right? So there's so many little things, little nuances that Mike Brown did, but he brought legitimacy and relevancy to an organization, and competency and consistency to an organization that desperately needed it, desperately lacked it. So if the New York Knicks were to go out and hire Mike Brown, while it's fair to question, can he get the job done? While I think would be fair to have nerves or anything of that point from a Knicks fan, one thing you can't question is this guy is well respected, well established around the league, and he is going to come in and he is going to embrace those expectations and do what he believes is the right thing to do to accomplish those expectations right away. And as we've seen a number of times in the past, Mike typically has a pretty he typically starts things pretty strong. So I'd feel pretty good in New York of the Knicks hitting the ground running if Mike Brown took over as their head coach.
All right, guys, we're going to continue our discussion with Matt in just a sec. But first, I want to tell you about our good friends over at FanDuel Sportsbook. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live with player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. I am looking ahead to next season where the New York Knicks are third in the NBA championship odds at plus 950, a little bit better even than their odds were last year. Vegas has a lot of confidence in the New York Knicks. It feels like the league outside of the Oklahoma City Thunder is pretty wide open. So why not the New York Knicks throw a little money down before they make a big trade for, I don't know, Jaren Jackson Jr. or knock their home run, knock their coaching hire out of the park, and those odds go down and you get not quite as good of a deal. If you're new to FanDuel, you're going to get a great deal because it's the perfect time to sign up. You can head to FanDuel.com, place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. It's so funny. I know I prefaced it with this, but you could have replaced Mike Brown with Tom Thibodeau, and everything you just said, and it all would have been true for what he brought to the Knicks. I think a key area where they differ is their philosophy on the offensive end of the floor. Can you hinted at it with the dribble handoffs? Can you explain what are the core tenets of his offensive philosophy? How much of that was just catered specifically to the Kings personnel versus just what he believes succeeds on the offensive end? And do you think, I would assume you would, but do you think he's one of the elite offensive minds in the NBA?
That last part is interesting because if you talk to players, Mike Brown is considered a defensive head coach.
Yeah.
Right. Like he is all about the defense. And when he started to emphasize the defense here in Sacramento, that's when things started going a little awry, and it's not just his fault. But let's start with the offense. Mike has what he calls pillars of his offense. And the two biggest ones that stuck out the most to me, he calls them paint touches and sprays, meaning like if you have Jalen Brunson gets downhill, he touches the paint, kicks out to Karl Anthony Towns in the corner, or Mikal Bridges on the wing or whatever. Like he is all about touching the paint and drawing the defense in and looking for the spray three, which is, in his opinion, one of the best shots that you can generate in basketball. So that is a major, major pillar of Mike Brown's offense. And then another major pillar of his was 0.5 seconds, meaning in half a second, you decide, am I going to attack? Am I going to shoot? Am I going to drive? Am I going to pass? What am I going to do with the basketball in 0.5 seconds? No wasting time, no dribbling the air out of the basketball. That doesn't mean isolation ball can't happen and doesn't have its place, because in Mike Brown's first year, De'Aaron Fox was the clutch player of the year by taking over in the fourth quarter with kind of his ISO heavy getting to his spots. But it's about having a purpose and intensity with what you do in half a second. Those were the two major pillars of Mike Brown's offense that he will bring with him anywhere. Like that is a philosophy, a tenet of how he believes the game of basketball should be played on the offensive end. But again, Mike is very defensively oriented. And I would say if he took over the New York Knicks, he'd have far better defensive options on that roster in New York than he really ever had in Sacramento. Doesn't mean he doesn't value offense or anything like that. And I do think he would provide a positive outlook and a positive impact on the offense of the Sacramento Kings. But Mike is not, in fact, he said this verbatim, and he didn't mean this as a shot at Mike D'Antoni necessarily, but he like references like he is not interested in being a team that scores a boatload of points and then flares out in the playoffs, because that's when you got to lock down defensively, right? He was very consistent with that throughout his entire time here in Sacramento. He will, I think, help the Knicks offense get better and improve, but he's not going to sacrifice the defense or not prioritize the defense in order to do so.
I think the 0.5 second point is incredibly appealing, because one of the single most frustrating things of the Knicks the last 2 years, particularly in the playoffs, was just how late in the shot clock they would get. And at times it was hard to tell, is that just Jalen Brunson's comfort zone? Is that Tom Thibodeau feeling at times, like most recently in the series against the Celtics, the Knicks didn't have the better team and wanting to limit possessions, and knowing that in a late shot clock game, because the Knicks had Jalen Brunson, other teams didn't, they would generally have an advantage in those scenarios? Whatever it was, it certainly it hurt them at times, and it really stood out against the Indiana Pacers, a team that I think play much closer to how Mike Brown would like to play. I'm also really fascinated to see, because you could correct me if I'm off on this, but I from when I saw the Kings and from what I've read about the Kings, like a lot of the actions were oriented around the elbow, and they made sense because Domantas Sabonis, at least until this past year, was not much of a 3-point shooter. De'Aaron Fox obviously can't shoot the basketball, but like relative to the point guard position, is not a great 3-point shooter. I'm curious how like running those same actions, maybe 30 feet from the rim instead of 18 feet from the rim, could change things with Karl-Anthony Towns' ability to hit way behind the arc, with Jalen Brunson's ability to hit way behind the arc. And if it functions the same way with Towns, who is a really talented standstill passer, but I don't think is in the same universe as Domantas Sabonis, who, more similar to a Nikola Jokic, or the Knicks version of that was Isaiah Hartenstein, is just like an elite quick processor. Like, could you tell me a little bit more about what the Kings did off the ball, how much they ran through Sabonis, and obviously this is really speculative for a team you don't watch obviously as much, but how you think it would look on the Knicks?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've all heard the term high post, right?
Yeah.
Which is, like you said, the elbow, kind of top of the key, where you run your action through that. But the Sacramento Kings would run their actions and their DHOs and their 2-man game with Sabonis and insert point guard here, whether it was Fox or Malik or whoever, well above the 3-point line.
Yeah.
Right. And the idea is to get as much space as possible to allow your speedy guards to get downhill. Of course, De'Aaron Fox, one of the fastest guards in the league when he was here in Sacramento. Malik Monk, very, very good in the pick and roll, very good at getting downhill and being creative in that sense. So the Kings felt more than comfortable with Domantas Sabonis above the 3-point arc, kind of getting the offense going. And I believe that with Jalen Brunson and Karl-Anthony Towns, there's definitely something there. I mean, even to some extent, I think Mitchell Robinson could do it to some extent, although maybe not as good of a roller or as good of an overall playmaker as Sabonis, of course, ever was, or Karl-Anthony Towns would be. But Cat, more known for his shooting ability. So unlike Sabonis, you could feel pretty good about that pick and pop opportunity if the defense does react and look to cut off Brunson or Bridges or whoever is coming off of the handoff and the action. But what Mike did is Mike emphasized what was on his roster, right? Mike knew, okay, we have De'Aaron Fox. We're going to play fast. We have Domantas Sabonis, whose instinct is to pass the basketball. And he's also a big body, a big frame, and hard for defenders to get around. Okay, we're going to use that to our advantage. So I think initially in Sacramento and initially in New York, Mike would do a really good job seeing what he has and trying to emphasize the strengths of what he has right away. Where it started to get tricky in Sacramento, and the Knicks are, again, further along in this sense than the Kings are, because they have more of an established core and identity and success, is it once he started going beyond, okay, just doing what we know we can do, now adding the areas and adding on expectations of weaknesses, right? Like the Kings, their roster still, like you look at this roster and you're like, there's not much defense on this roster. There's good individual defenders. Keon Ellis is one of those really good individual defenders. Keegan Murray has developed into a really, really good individual defender. Overall, like, this is not a defensive roster, but Mike wasn't going to just accept, hey, Malik Monk, you don't play defense. Okay, fine. Like that's not who Mike is. So what Mike's going to do is, or what I believe he would do in New York, is emphasize the strengths of his pieces, right? Try and find a way to implement his actions that emphasize the strengths of Cat and Brunson and Bridges and all these guys that are there. But on the other side, eventually too, and maybe even more so right away, he could do this in New York, unlike Sacramento, because of how far they've gone. Right away, he's going to be going, hey, there's no reason why you can't do this. There's no reason why you can't do that. And I'm not saying specifically Jalen Brunson, but Mike was harder on his stars than he was on anybody. Mike coached De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis harder than anybody. But he also was not afraid to get on Malik Monk. So much so there were screaming matches between the two at the time. Again, some of these things kind of led to Mike's fallout here in Sacramento. And I would argue, because I'm very much a team Mike Brown guy, that speaks to kind of the softness of Sacramento's locker room. But like Jalen has to understand that, hey, man, you can score 35 points, but if you're not busting your ass on the defensive end, we got a problem. Cat, like none of this soft crap. Like you got to play physical on both ends of the ball. That's who Mike is going to be. His way of getting that message across is going to be something to keep an eye on, I think, for yourself and for New York media. And also, he needs to establish the relationship with Brunson and with Cat and with Bridges to be able to coach like that. I found it refreshing. I found it needed here in Sacramento. I know not every star or every player responds to getting yelled and screamed at. And Mike will also put his arm around a guy and laugh with a guy. He's got a phenomenal personality like that. But in a long roundabout way of answering your question, Mike will try and emphasize the strengths of that New York Knicks roster, but he's not going to let the weaknesses just, oh, that's who they are. Like he never will be okay with that.
Yeah, and I think that's crucially important because it is an open question for a team, to your point, that by firing Tom Thibodeau signaled that it is, I mean, I don't even want to say championship or bust, but championships are the goal. And there was a recognition that the process had to be better. And the process, despite the fact that the final result was good and the Knicks got to the Eastern Conference Finals, was not good enough. And there is an open question. Can you win an NBA championship with two defenders as bad as Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns playing probably at a minimum 35 minutes per game in the playoffs? And I don't know if there's a coach on planet Earth that can answer that question, but I do think, to your point, it is important that those two guys are challenged. And it was something that Tom Thibodeau, both in terms of just like vocally challenging those guys, like publicly calling them out, was not something he really did. I don't know if that's right or wrong. I know it's something that Jalen Brunson, like who's just an elite competitor and just flat out, I would say, one of the more like emotionally mature players in the NBA. Like I have no real concerns about his ability to handle that. Karl Anthony Towns, I think at this point in his career, can handle that. Obviously, there are more questions there. There are questions about Mikal Bridges, who had his complaints publicly about how Tom Thibodeau distributed minutes this year. There are concerns with OG Anunoby, who at times might have been a locker room issue, and that's been hinted at from a lot of different reporting over the course of this year. So I am fascinated because I think for a veteran team with guys that on an individual level are relatively well-intentioned. And to your point, I certainly not 2 years ago, maybe this year was a little bit more of an open question. I would not categorize the Knicks locker room as soft by any means, but I do think there are open questions about how they'd handle that type of coaching. But the reality might be that they need that type of coaching to get to their ultimate goal. Before we moved on from the defense, I wanted to make sure I got it nailed down. Does he have core principles on the defensive end? And also, how flexible is he on that end? Because one of the more frustrating aspects of Coach Thibodeau, while obviously a brilliant defensive mind, I mean, revolutionized NBA defense, right, with Ice in the late 2000s, he was not very flexible in terms of how he wanted to play, refused to even try a zone when that seemed like the cleanest way to hide Karl Anthony Towns' very obvious deficiencies as a pick and roll defender. I know you got somewhat limited exposure to Mike Brown as a playoff coach, but do you think, based on that series against the Warriors and what you saw in the regular season, is he someone who's willing to throw like curveballs based on specific opponents, and to your points, based on the specific weaknesses of his players?
Yeah, I mean, he'll try different things. Again, he's working with a roster in Sacramento, or he worked with a roster in Sacramento, excuse me, that defensively, like they had very severe limitations. So like on defense, the Kings were extremely switch heavy, right? Very switch heavy. They would give you like basically switch everything, right? And weak side defenders are incredibly important in Mike Brown's system, right? You do not just stand around and watch, right? The weak side defender, whoever's pretty much guarding the corner, be ready to sprint to the rim to cut off a drive or help with a box out, right? Mike is very much an all hands on deck. You should not be standing around on defense at all, at any point, whether the ball is right in front of you and you're defending it, or the ball is on the other end of the floor. Like, you're never standing around, heads on a swivel, and you're always looking to communicate and be impactful. I do believe that Mike would adjust and fluctuate and make changes on the fly. In fact, Mike told a story that's always stuck with me. He told this story more from to emphasize leadership, but I think there's a defensive lesson to be learned from this too. He talked about his time in Cleveland with very young LeBron. He talked about how the team worked all training camp on a very specific defensive identity. Like they said, this is who we're going to be. This is what we're going to do. They worked on it all preseason, all training camp long. Early on in the season, like game 3, 4, 5 of the season, they're getting destroyed, right? Like, they are just very, very, very much struggling. And Mike calls a timeout. And by the way, Mike is not afraid to call timeouts very, very quickly. Like, we're talking a minute into a game. Sometimes it would annoy players, but he'll nip things at the bud and address it right away. He won't let it drag out. But he called a timeout and he brings everybody together and he goes, all right, guys, what do you want to do? Like, this isn't working. Like, what do we want to do? And the way he tells the story is LeBron James stood up at that moment and said, F that. Like, this is who we are. This is what we're working on. And then LeBron proceeded to go, you do this, you do this, you do this. He tells that story and to emphasize the importance of on the court leadership. So whether that's Jalen Brunson or Cat or whoever that goes, you do this, like he believes very much in taking a back seat when he needs to, right? Especially with the team with established veterans and championship expectations. So I think he would try and empower the voices of the leadership on the New York Knicks roster. But I think that story also illustrates that he might emphasize something and have like, this is the way we want to play defensively. But if it's not going to work, or if it's not working at the time, I think he's open to making changes, whether it's trying out a zone for certain possessions or trying different individual defensive options. He was not shy at all about having Keegan Murray guard Steph Curry at times. Then De'Aaron Fox was guarding Steph Curry at times. Then they threw Davion Mitchell to guard Steph Curry at times, right? Throwing different looks at different people. Like, he will fluctuate with different things. Kind of a branch of that I wanted to hit on that I make sure we touch on before I don't forget is the biggest difference between Tom Thibodeau and Mike Brown, in my opinion, is like gone would be the days of the starters or 6 people playing 40 plus minutes, like, and nobody else is playing, right? Like, Mike emphasizes depth. There were many times in Sacramento where Mike would look at his bench and just go like, who wants to give me something? You go. Like, if he's not getting what he expects from anybody, whether it's the number 1 guy or the number 10 guy, certain guys will have longer leashes, of course.
Sure.
But he's not afraid to sit you down and go, I'm get ready, like, get in the game and give me something. So that would be a massive difference between Thibodeau and Brown. Is he's still going to play his starters and his guys heavy minutes, but he talked a lot about playing DeMar DeRozan upper echelon of high 30s to even 40 minutes a night to start last season. And he, without even being asked about it, would say in his post-game press conferences, man, I gotta find a way to not play them that much. I gotta find other guys. So Knicks fans, that might be music to your ears. Mike Brown is not going to run your stars ragged for 82 games. He's going to look to emphasize as much depth as possible and make sure everybody is ready at all times, because he could call on them at any times. If the Knicks are down 15 in the first quarter because they're having a bad start against Orlando, Mike will go to the 9th, 10th, 11th guy on the bench and say, you haven't played in a week. I don't care. Get in there and give me something.
Yeah, I think that is incredibly encouraging. It is music to my ears. I think it is probably the main appeal of Taylor Jenkins, the other coach that's getting interviewed by the Knicks. So it's nice to know that's a quality Mike Brown has as well. I wanted to ask you, though, about a specific guy on the bench, because I was getting some, I guess, retroactive PTSD flashbacks just reading about what happened with Keon Ellis this year. It is very reminiscent of how Tom Thibodeau treated Deuce McBride, who was, like, maybe Kings fans, this will be a familiar story. Deuce McBride was the only player on the Knicks that featured in all 6 of their top lineups, like excellent 3-point shooter, excellent defender, just completely additive when he was on the floor, and supplemental in that he did not need the basketball in his hands to be highly impactful around 2 stars, where some of the other guys, like, say, Mikal Bridges, specifically a Josh Hart, desperately needed the basketball in their hands to be impactful around Jalen Brunson and Karl-Anthony Towns. And Tom Thibodeau just did not seem to recognize that impact because of some biases that he may had in terms of, like, what wins at the NBA level in terms of size, even if the numbers screamed something else. Would you categorize that as a similar description for why Keon Ellis, who tell me if I'm off on this, I think is very analogous to everything I just said about Deuce McBride, didn't always see a significant role and was not a starter, even though it seemed like it made a ton of sense for him to be a starter? Or why did Mike Brown not push that button?
Yeah, Keon Ellis is one of the most obvious mistakes, or probably the most obvious mistake or example of mishandling that Mike Brown had in his time here in Sacramento. Now, there's a lot more behind the scenes. I'll just say this.
Sure.
There's a lot more behind the scenes to everything that went on than what is out there. And things aren't always what they seem. Like sometimes a coach stands on their beliefs, and other times the coach is emphasizing what is a directive out of the organization. Let's put it that way.
That's a good way to phrase it.
Yeah. That being said, like I had conversations firsthand with Mike about the handling of Keon Ellis, and Mike's thing was always like Keon was a two-way player converted into his first major NBA contract. Mike would emphasize, if you talk to him about it, he'd say, I was the guy that gave Keon his first shot. Keon got his first opportunity at the end of a blowout where the Kings were getting rinsed in Houston. And Keon Ellis comes in and plays in garbage time with the Kings down like 30. Plays really well. De'Aaron Fox goes down with an injury. It's the in-season tournament, in the inaugural in-season tournament. De'Aaron Fox goes down. Mike was very much a stickler on Malik Monk as a sixth man. I want him coming off my bench. So suddenly Keon Ellis is vaulted into the starting lineup. The Kings beat the Oklahoma City Thunder that night. Right. And for a while it was fun because the Kings were undefeated with Keon Ellis as a starter for the first like 6, 7, 8 times they did it in Keon's young career. But Mike was very stickler on like De'Aaron Fox, Malik Monk, all these other guards have a significantly longer leash than Keon Ellis. And while Keon Ellis does make really, really good defensive plays, Keon Ellis also gambles. And if he gambles and the gamble fails and it leaves the rest of the team in rotation and desperation mode and it leads to a breakdown and a bucket, Mike is going to be harder on Keon about that than he is about anybody else, right? If De'Aaron Fox gambles for a steal versus Keon Ellis gambling for a steal, you can imagine which one is going to have a longer leash, right? That's what Mike was all about. And again, he talked to me about this verbatim. He felt so passionately about this that like he was willing to kind of take the heat and take the flack for this because this is how he felt he needed to help Keon Ellis grow and help Keon Ellis develop. At times, and this is where I think there is a similarity between Mike Brown and Thibs, Mike was stubborn. I think Mike is a naturally stubborn coach, not in a way where he's closed-minded, but Mike is very firm in his beliefs, and he's open to you challenging them, but you have to win him over, right? He talked about coming into this past season, the Kings suddenly had this emphasis on crashing the offensive glass, and that came from, at the time, general manager Monty McNair. He said the analytics, our roster, we should be better at crashing the offensive glass. Mike was a little closed-minded to that. And Mike shared with us, like, we talked it over a lot over the summer. We said, okay, we're going to give it a try. And it kind of won Mike over. So Mike's not going to like shut anything down. He's open to trying different things, but he is very firm and very strong in his convictions. And at times, I think that got him a little bit in trouble. I think there are times that he mishandled the Kevin Huerter situation. Huerter's first year in Sacramento, that playoff year, shot phenomenally. And then Mike looked to kind of change the starting lineup to bring in some more defense, killed the confidence of Kevin Huerter. Huerter was never really the same from that point on. And I do think Mike wears some of the blame for that. So different circumstances, but the Keon Ellis situation is probably the biggest fumble in Mike's tenure here in Sacramento. It isn't. He shouldn't have lost his job because of it. He lost his job because of a combination of things. And again, I don't think the Kings ever should have fired Mike Brown. But that Keon Ellis thing is probably the biggest. If you talk about his Kings tenure, that's going to be the biggest, most obvious thing that people go, that's where he screwed up.
We could go 2 hours on Mike Brown because he's a fascinating guy and you clearly know everything about him. But
I love the man. I genuinely love the man. And like Gavin, you'll get the understanding too. Like Mike will teach the game. Yeah. Mike will walk you through what he's doing. Sometimes Mike says too much. And I've told Mike that before. Like, Mike, you don't have to tell us this. I appreciate the honesty and I appreciate the transparency, but like I could sell you out right now. And I'm of course not trying to do that. But Mike loves the game of basketball and he wants everybody to understand the game of basketball. And he does not shy away from the criticism either, which I know he would get a bunch of in New York because it's just New York, right? So if you want an endorsement from Mike Brown, you got a big one here from Matt George of Locked On Kings. But I don't know if that's the right job for him, but if he gets it, I'll be happy for him.
All right. So to that point, real quick, because you've hinted maybe seeing both sides of it. Do you think he'd succeed in New York?
It's championship or bust, man. Let's put it this way. And again, this is coming from someone who loves Mike Brown. I don't know why I would choose Mike Brown over Michael Malone for that circumstance, that situation. Personally, I would take him over Taylor Jenkins. Taylor has done a more consistent job recently, but Mike's been there, done that before with expectations. So I would take Mike over Jenkins. But I mean, I would go for Michael Malone if I were the New York Knicks. I also am a huge Michael Malone fan and believer from his time here in Sacramento and how the Kings mishandled that. Add it to the list. But I don't. There's no world where it would be a bad hire. Any coach, even like you could bring any coach out of retirement. You could have Greg Popovich be amazingly healthy and 15 years younger, and you'd give him this job, and there would be an element of concern and hesitation because of the weight of expectations. I think you'll have that with anybody that you hire. Lean on Mike's experience and his personality, and I think you can feel pretty good about the chances. But that's a job that, like you talk about, no room for error. So that job comes with the heavy weight of expectations, which I think Mike would embrace.
Look, it takes a special personality. We saw it in Boston with Joe Mazzulla, and he's a little bit of a psychopath, but maybe that's what they needed with Ime Udoka gone and saying, all right, championship or bust, first time head coach in any situation, go for it, buddy. And he obviously succeeded. We'll see if it's Mike Brown. We'll see if it's Taylor Jenkins. Maybe Mike Malone does eventually get an interview, but until then, Matt George, Locked On Kings, ABC 10 Sacramento. Thank you so much, buddy.
Always a pleasure, my man. Good luck. Good luck to the Knicks, and I'd rather be you than the Kings right now, so don't worry.
That's a good note to end on. We'll call it there.